The Saturn Theory by David Talbot. Introduction. Planet Saturn today is recognizable only to those who know where to look for it. But a few thousand years ago, Saturn dominated the Earth as a sun, presiding over a universal golden age. Modern man considers it self-evident that our familiar heavens differ hardly at all from the heavens encountered by the earliest star worshipper. He assumes that the most distinctive bodies venerated in primitive times were the sun and moon, followed by the 5 visible planets, and various constellations all appearing as they do today. But for such ever so slight changes as the precession of the equinox, this long-lasting belief not only confines present discussion, but ancient myth and religion. It is the fixed doctrine of modern astronomy and geology, every prevailing theory of the solar system and of the Earth's past rests upon an underlying doctrine of cosmic uniformity. The belief that the clock-like regularity of the heavenly motions can be projected backwards indefinitely. But the evidence assembled in the following pages indicates that within human memory, extraordinary changes in the planetary system occurred. In the earliest age recalled by man, the planet Saturn was the most spectacular light in the heavens, and its impact on the ancient world overwhelming. In fact, Saturn was the one great god, invoked by all mankind. The first religious symbols were symbols of Saturn, and so pervasive was the planet God's influence that the ancients knew him as the creator, the king of the world, and Adam, the first man. Since the only meaningful defense of this claim is the entire body of evidence presented here, I shall not presume upon the reader's credulity, but only ask that he follow the narrative to its end. Myth and catastrophe. If our generation disdains the possibility of fact in the language of myth, it is because we are aware of discrepancy between myth and the modern worldview, as we ascribe it to the blindness or superstition of the ancients. There is hardly an ancient tale which fails to speak of world-destroying upheavals and shifting cosmic orders. Indeed, we are so accustomed to the catastrophic character of the stories that we hardly give it a second thought. When the myths tell of suns which have come and gone, or of planetary gods whose wars threatened to destroy mankind, we are likely to take them as amusing and absurdly exaggerated accounts of local floods, earthquakes, and eclipses, or write them off altogether as expressions of unconstrained fancy. How many scholars, seeking to unravel the astronomical legends and symbols of antiquity, have questioned whether the heavenly bodies have always coursed on the same paths they follow today. In the past 300 years, barely a handful of writers have claimed any connection between myth and actual celestial catastrophe. William Whitson published in 1696 a new theory of the Earth, arguing that the biblical deluge resulted from a cometary cataclysm. The book produced a storm of scientific objections and had no lasting impact outside Christian orthodoxy. In 1882 and 1883, 2 books by Ignatius Donnelly appeared: Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, and Ragnarok, the Age of Fire and Gravel. Relying on global myths, Donnelly claimed that a massive continent called Atlantis once harbored a primordial civilization. The entire land sank beneath the sea when a comet rained destruction on the Earth. Both Donnelly's books became bestsellers and are still available today. Yet conventional theories of Earth and the solar system remain unaffected by these works. Around the turn of the century, Isaac Vail argued in a series of brief papers that myths of cosmic upheaval relate to the collapse of ice bands surrounding our planet. 3/4 of a century after his death, his work is familiar only to an esoteric few. In 1913, Hans Horbiger published his Glacial Cosmogony, contending that great catastrophes described in ancient myth occurred when the Earth captured another planet, which became our moon. The relatively small interest in Horbiger's thesis vanished within a couple decades. This was the extent of noteworthy research into myth and catastrophe. When Immanuel Velikovsky, in early 1940, first wondered whether a cosmic disturbance may have accompanied the Hebrew Exodus, according to the biblical account, massive plagues occurred, Sinai erupted, and the pillar of cloud and fire moved in the sky. His quest for a solution led Velikovsky through a systematic survey of world mythology, and eventually to the conclusion that ancient myths constitute a collective memory of celestial disorder. The great gods, Velikovsky observed, appeared explicitly as planets. In the Titanic wars vividly depicted by ancient chroniclers, the planets moved on erratic courses, appearing to wage battles in the sky, exchanging electrical discharges, and more than once menacing the Earth. Velikovsky set forth his claims of celestial catastrophe in his book Worlds in Collision, published in 1950, proposing the first Venus and then Mars in the period 1500 to 686 BC, so disturbed the Earth's axis as to produce worldwide destruction. The book became an immediate bestseller and the focus of one of the great scientific controversies of this century. I mention Velikovsky not only because his work obviously relates to the thesis of this book, but because, as a matter of record, Velikovsky first directed my attention toward Saturn. In a manuscript still awaiting publication, Velikovsky proposed that the now distant planet was once the dominant heavenly body, and he identified Saturn's epoch with the legendary Golden Age. While I have not seen Velikovsky's unpublished manuscript on Saturn, a brief outline of his idea inspired present inquiry. Was Saturn once the preeminent light in the heavens? Yet I possessed at the outset no conception of the broad thesis presented here, which fell into place with surprising rapidity once I set out to reconstruct the Saturn myth, while expecting to find at best only faint echoes of Saturn, or no hint at all. I found instead that the ancients, looking back to the beginnings, were obsessed with the planet god and strove in 1,000 ways to relive Saturn's epoch. The most common symbols of antiquity, which our age universally regards as solar emblems, were originally unrelated to our sun. They were literal pictures of Saturn, whom the entire ancient world invoked as the sun. In the original age, to which the myths refer, Saturn was no remote speck faintly discerned by terrestrial observers. The planet loomed as an awesome and terrifying light, and if we are to believe the widespread accounts of Saturn's age, the planet god's home was the unmoving celestial pole, the apparent pivot of the heavens, far removed from the visible path of Saturn today. At first glance, however, the Saturn myth seems to present an entanglement of bizarre images. The earliest, most venerated religious texts depict the great god sailing in a celestial ship, consorting with winged goddesses, fashioning revolving islands, cities, and temples, or abiding upon the shoulders of a cosmic giant. It is impossible to pursue Saturn's ancient image without encountering the paradise of Eden, the lost Atlantis, the fountain of youth, the one-wheeled chariot of the gods, the all-seeing eye of heaven, or the serpent dragon of the deep. Though celebrated as living, visible powers, none of Saturn's personifications or mythical habitats conforms to anything in our familiar world. Yet once one seeks out the concrete nature of these images, it becomes clear that each referred to the same celestial form. The subject is a Saturnian configuration of startling simplicity, whose appearance, transformation, and eventual disappearance become the focus of all ancient rites. I now have little doubt that if Velikovsky had pursued the Saturn question to the end, he would have perceived a vastly greater influence of the planet than he originally recognized. He would have discovered also that the full story of Saturn adds a new perspective to much of the mythological material gathered in Worlds in Collision. In this connection, I must stress that I alone am responsible for the themes and conclusions presented in this book. Realizing that Velikovsky has had to defend his own heresy for better than a quarter of a century, I have no desire to burden him with the heresy of others. Nothing came as a greater surprise to me than the sheer quantity of material bearing directly on the Saturn tradition. The scope of the subject matter made it necessary to separate the material into 2 volumes, the first dealing with the original Saturnian apparition, the second with Saturn's catastrophic fate. This initial volume, then, focuses on the primordial age of cosmic harmony and the unified image of Saturn as king of the world. Chapter 2. The Great Father. Anyone attempting to trace the Saturn legend must reckon with the primordial god figure whom ancient races celebrate as the Great Father, and who is said to have first organized the heavens and founded the antediluvian kingdom of peace and plenty, the Golden Age. While few of us today could locate Saturn in a starry sphere, the earliest astro-religions insist that the planet god was once the all-powerful ruler of heaven. But paradoxically, they also declare that he resided on earth as a great king. He was the father both of gods and of men. This dual character of the Great Father has been the subject of a centuries-long exaggerated into cosmic divinity. This dual character of the Great Father has been the subject of a centuries-long but unresolved debate. Was he a living ancestor, subsequently exaggerated into a cosmic divinity? Or was he originally a celestial god whom later myths reduced to human proportions? For an explanation of the Great Father, researchers look to such varied powers as the solar orb, an esteemed tribal chief, or an abstract vegetation cycle. Almost uniformly ignored is the connection of the primordial man-god with the actual planet Saturn, even though it is precisely the latter that can tell us why the Great Father appears in both human and celestial form. The overwhelming preoccupation of ancient ritual is with an ancient great god. 1. The myths say that the god emerged alone from the cosmic sea as the preeminent power in the heavens. Out of watery chaos he produced a new order. The ancients worshipped him as the creator and the supreme lord of the cosmos. 2. This solitary god, according to the legend, founded a kingdom of unparalleled splendor. He was the divine ancestor of all earthly rulers. His kingdom, the prototype of the just and prosperous realm, throughout his reign, an unending spring prevailed. The land produced freely, and men knew neither labor nor war. 3. In the god-king's towering form, and ancients perceived the heaven-man, a primordial giant, whose body was the newly organized cosmos. The legends often present the figure as the first man or primordial man, whose history personified the struggle of good and evil. 4. Whether emphasizing the Great Father's character as creator, first king, or heaven man, widespread traditions proclaim him to be the planet Saturn. In investigating the traits of the archaic god, we must give greatest weight to the oldest astral religions, those which are closest to the original experience. Yes, that's a great way of putting it. That's what I've always been searching for. The best material coming from ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia provides a remarkably coherent picture of the god and enables one to see the development and the distortions of the idea among later people. What is most surprising, however, is the enduring power of the root themes. The one God of archaic monotheism. In the beginning, the ancients knew one supreme God only, a divinity invoked as the creator and the father of all gods. According to a long-established school of thought, man's consciousness of a supreme being emerged slowly from a primitive fascination with petty spirits and demons. Adherents to this opinion tell us that human reason gradually modified capricious spirits of vegetation, spring, the ancestors, or sexual power into the great gods of global religion. Of such an evolutionary process, however, one finds little evidence. The great edifices erected by Herbert Spencer, E.B. Taylor, and James G. Fraser appear to rest exclusively on the assumption that one can learn the origins of theism by studying existing primitive cultures. The idea is that the civilized races of old must have first passed through primitive phases before the Hebrews, Greeks, or Hindus developed their elevated ideas of a supreme God. They must have possessed beliefs and customs similar to those of modern-day tribes of Africa, Australia, or Polynesia. Only by slow development, say these theorists, could a race rise above the ludicrous magic totems and fetishes of the savage. It is interesting that the advocates of various evolutionary theories and their fascination with present-day primitive cultures almost never concern themselves with the oldest religious texts and symbols which have come down to us. The sacred hymns and eulogies of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia reveal a tradition of a great god reaching back into prehistoric times. Moreover, a comparison of early and later sources rather than of a once unified idea into magic, astrology, totemism, and other elements with which the evolutionists associate the first stages of religion. There are grounds for speaking of an archaic monotheism, astral in nature, existing long before the idea of God received its spiritual and philosophical elevation in Hebrew and Greek thought. To the ancients themselves, the entire question was simply a matter of concrete history. The present world is a fragmented copy of an earlier age, in which the supreme light God stood alone in a primeval sea, accompanying the cosmic center. Ancient Egyptian texts repeatedly invoke a singular figure, worshipped as the great and highest light of the primeval age. One of his many names was Atum, a god born in the abyss before the sky existed, before the earth existed. These are worlds of the pyramid texts, perhaps the world's oldest religious hymns, but the texts of all periods look back to the same primordial time when Atum shone forth alone. I came into being of myself in the midst of the primeval waters, states the god in the Book of the Dead. More than once, the coffin texts recall the time when Atum was alone before he had repeated himself. He was alone in the primeval waters, they say. I was the spirit in the primeval waters, he who had no companion when my name came into existence. Each locality in Egypt appears to have possessed its own special representative of the Father God. To some, he was Horus, the god who came first into being when no other god had yet come into existence, when no name of anything had yet been proclaimed. Other traditions knew him as Ra, the god one who came into being in the beginning of time. O thou who didst give thyself birth, O one mighty, one of myriad forms and aspects, King of the world. The followers of Amen proclaimed their God, the Ancient of Heaven, Father of the gods. Ptah was the splendid God who existed alone in the beginning. The different local names of the primeval deity, though adding complexity to Egyptian religion as a whole, do not cloud the underlying idea. He is the one God. He is the God one, and only one, the Father of beginnings, the Supreme Lord, the singular God, except whom at the beginning none other existed. Surveying Egyptian religion, one cannot fail to notice that the priests' obsession with the past and their vivid portrait of the great God in his first appearance, those who look for an unseen creator in early Egyptian religion will be disappointed. He is a visible and concrete power, the Lord of Terror, or the Great of Terror. The memory of this solidarity light, God and Creator, was as old as the most ancient Egyptian ritual. His appearance and even departure shaped every aspect of the Egyptian worldview. So also in Mesopotamia, about which Stephen Langdon raises the question of archaic monotheism. After a prolonged study of Semitic and Sumerian sources, Langdon concludes that veneration of spirits and demons had nothing to do with the origins of Mesopotamian religion. Rather, both in Sumerian and Semitic religions, monotheism preceded polytheism and belief in good and evil spirits. Langdon notes that on the pictographic tablets, on the painted pots of the prehistoric period, the picture of a star repeatedly appears. The sign, he claims, is virtually the only religious symbol in the primitive period. And in the early Sumerian language, this star symbol is the ideogram for writing God, high, heaven, and bright. It is also the ideogram of An, the oldest and loftiest of the Sumerian gods. An, or Anu, was the father of the gods and the central light at the universe summit, a god of terrifying splendor who governed heaven from his throne in the cosmic sea, Apsu. The Sumero-Babylonian pantheon is filled with competing figures of the primordial creator. Enki, or Ea, Ningirsu, Ninurta, Tammuz, each appears as a local formulation of the same great god. Each shares in the character of the singular An, ruling as universal Lord, fashioning his home above the radiating light in the midst of the celestial ocean. Here, as in Egypt, the god of archaic monotheism is not a transcendent spirit nor invisible power, but a central light. A Sumerian epic to Ninurta proclaims Anu, in the midst of heaven, gave him fearful splendor. Ninurta, according to the text, is like Anu and casts a shadow of glory over the land. All Mesopotamian figures of the primeval god possessed this tangible character, and accounts of the god's radiant appearance are more of a historical than a speculative nature. Egyptian and Mesopotamian tradition of the solitary creator find many parallels in later Hebrew, Greek, Persian, Hindu, and Chinese mysticism and philosophy. But it is the earlier imagery which illuminates the latter. And however unorthodox the idea may seem, the oldest records treat the great God's birth in the deep and his acts of creation as events experienced by the ancestors. Hearts were pervaded with fear. Hearts were pervaded with terror. When I was born in the abyss, proclaims the God of the pyramid text. The solitary God, in the presence of the ancestors, brought forth the primeval world, or earth. To understand the great God's creation, one must put aside modern philosophical and religious conception. The tradition has nothing to do with the origins of our planet or of the material universe. The subject of the original creation legend is the formation of the great God's visible dwelling above. The legend records that when the Creator rose from the cosmic sea, a great band or revolving island congealed around the god as his home. The band appeared as a well-defined, organized, and geometrically unified dwelling, a celestial land fashioned by the Great Father. All space outside this enclosure belonged to unorganized chaos.